Everyone, thank you for joining our webinar, MFA Pass or Fail, how CISA, PCI, and the FBI are auditing MFA, presented by Axiad and hosted by CyberEdge Group. Feel free to utilize our Ask a Question feature to submit any questions you have at any time during the presentation. We're going to be collecting your questions and we'll address them at the end of the session once our speaker's presentation has concluded. One lucky attendee is going to win a $100 Amazon e-gift card, but you must be present for the whole webinar to be eligible to win, so stick around. And finally, you can find some downloadable content related to today's webinar topic in the related content section of your webinar console. Joining us today is Michael Thielander, Director of Product Marketing at Axiad. Let's get kicked off. Michael, over to you.
Chrissy, thank you so much. And thank you everybody for joining us on this webinar today. And I appreciate you joining because it's an interesting topic, and but it's also you can read and go, well, that's kind of boring. Can anything be more boring than talking about CISA and CISA and PCI and their own requirements for MFA? That's a little bit of an alphabet soup. But in reality, we're trying to solve a problem. And I use this image not just because a friend teased me that said, hey, that person looks like you, but because this is the current state of folks when they're trying to deal with their MFA implementation, and especially with audits. So today we're going to look at how do you pass or fail MFA audits? What's changing with CISA? What's changing with PCI? What's changing in CJIS, governed by the FBI, and those audits for MFA? How are things actually looking a little bit different? As Chrissy said, my name is Michael Thielander, and I'm with Axiad. But my interest and passion in really looking at deeply into MFA solutions and how they change our lives goes back a little bit further than Axiad. I rolled out the first MFA solution available for iovation about 15 years ago, 10, 15 years ago, and then worked at Venafi for a number of years in the machine identity space, really understanding credential management, lifecycle management of keys and certificates, and what that would mean eventually to MFA. So my interest in solving this guy's problem, let's just say that this is our IT administrator trying to figure out how to get his MFA deployed, is really looking at why have the audits become so difficult? From an auditor perspective, what are they looking for that they were not looking at before? What do the regulations ask us to look at that we were not looking at before? And where did this come from? A lot of it does come from current news. I think every one of us, myself included, has been impacted to some degree by the Change Healthcare attacks that happened early last year, almost a year ago now. And I think that we've all looked at it very closely and followed it on a forensic level, not only because we're probably most likely affected by it, but because it's a very clear indication of what's happening as a company tries to adopt MFA, tries to roll out MFA in their organization. But then, despite their best efforts, despite their good intentions, there's a lot of things that have to do with timing and integration and how those things work and get rolled out to a populace. And then the HIPAA Journal, for example, looks at this report and says, really, MFA is the root of all. It's the root of the ability of the attackers to exploit this situation. May or may not be true. There's a lot of things that go into any given attack. Adversaries are using a lot of different levers, but it has brought attention to, obviously, to MFA and deployment of MFA. So again, go back to my friend here. What is causing these headaches? Is it because the MFA that we have today is not phishing resistant and it needs to be? Because we're now managing MFA really in a world that's integrated with machines and workloads, and that has exploded and caused an impact on our MFA solutions. Is it because managing hardware tokens and hardware security keys is really killing our staff? They were never really prepared for it. Or that PKI, which is the root of a lot of the new credential management things that we have to do, is to some degree unmanageable. Well, we're going to dig into these and we're going to try to explore what auditors are specifically looking for, what several mandates say, and how we can overall just make audits easier, make them more achievable, make it easier to go into the audit and figure out like what it is that we're ultimately trying to achieve with it. We're going to look at a few audit standards, and I have a sort of standard question for the audience, like which of these affect you? PCI DSS, are you looking for, if you're in the government, if you're a government agency or department, are you specifically looking for FedRAMP compliance? In bulk electric, in the BES system, are you looking for NERC-CIP compliance, or are you looking for just guidelines from CISA? All of these have things to say about MFA, and all of the things they have to say about MFA are changing to some degree. So I'm going to break this session down into 3 parts for you today. hopefully keep you engaged. Some parts will go fast, some parts will go a little bit slower, but we're going to talk about what's wrong with current MFA. What's the good, the bad, and the ugly of current MFA, and what are we faced with, and what are adversaries doing in the field that we see impacting our MFA solutions. We will spend some time talking about what regulations say about MFA. What do we mean by phishing-resistant MFA if that pops up in a regulation? And then how do we achieve that? So we're going to talk about adding credentials to current MFA. Couple of key messages hopefully will keep coming through the slides that we go through. One is we're not looking to rip and replace a current MFA solution. We're looking for a way to augment those solutions to make them work in the current landscape and in the current world of audits. We're also not looking to bash on any particular technology. This is an evolution. It's an evolution of what's happened in the MFA space and the security space. And as we know, we've been using MFA as really the front gate for all of it sort of replaced the old notion of the perimeter. Despite our efforts at zero trust architectures, we still have sort of a front gate mentality, and MFA is that solution. And I expect everybody on this call knows what we mean when we say MFA is really built around, three forms, factors, knowledge factors, possession factors, and inherence factors. Things you know versus something that you have in your hand or have available to present, or it's digitally loaded, or that's something that you are, whether it's your eye print, or your iris. We know those things, but what's happening is that the possession factors and inherence factors are becoming a little bit more important. Knowledge factors, obviously, is what we're trying to get away of. And a lot of the weight is actually going right there in that middle section, which is the possession factor, something that you can have in your hand, the certificate itself, the credentials. It's getting a lot of scrutiny, MFA in general, and getting a little bit of barbs pointed at it. This is from the Hacker News, and it's just a few months ago at the end of July, where it basically said, hey, there's a 500% surge in ransomware losses. It must be MFA failures. MFA failures are driving this. And there is some truth to that, but it's not a failure of MFA as a principle. There's lots of different ways to deploy MFA. So is ransomware really getting that much better, or is MFA getting that much worse? I need to roll back the clock a little bit and just talk about the progression of MFA and where it came from. This is helpful, I think, to understand that this is not something that's new. This is the evolution of adversaries going along with the evolution of our technologies. But if you go back to about 2015, this is really when the big names in MFA kind of made themselves known. Octaping, Duo, really started establishing themselves. It's when Microsoft really started transitioning from Azure AD into Microsoft Entra and making it its own thing, making it a full-fledged MFA solution that could work across mixed environments, not just Microsoft, but mixed heterogeneous environments, when they started rolling out Windows Hello for Business. And I think that this was sort of the heyday of MFA. MFA is going to save everything at around 2015 when this happened. But then not long after that, some holes started appearing in MFA. I think the first thing that we saw was weakness in SMS protocols, the SS7 routing protocol that enabled SMS communication. SMS communication is what enables, in many cases, one-time passwords, right? So that kind of authentication that goes on within the MFA solution. In Germany, a case came up where a gang of hackers, adversaries, actually exploited a number of banks and siphoned money out of those accounts because they were able to exploit that SS7 routing protocol. And then not long after that, the FBI also issued a warning. They specifically issued a warning because we started seeing attack kits available on the dark web, not just exploitation, manipulation by hand of a vulnerability or exploit, but kits, NecroBrowser, Murane, kits like that became available. That made it a lot easier for people to bypass the two-factor part of MFA, really just looking at that second OTP, that token or password. Krebs did an article on it in 2021. If you don't read Krebs, please do. It's one of the most insightful things that you can do in cybersecurity, obviously. But looking at the burden of responsibility on corporations that had looked at MSS because it was a relatively inexpensive way to get into multi-factor authentication, but yet then had rested on their laurels to some degree, not really improved it or evolved it. In the same year, we started seeing this really interesting and somewhat scary integration of technology. Telegram-powered bots using basically based on OTP and the reuse of OTPs to drive attacks that were actually fairly successful in 2021. 2022, the focus shifts a little bit. We start looking at other kinds of MFA. We all remember the Uber attack in 2022. And there's a lot of insight that we can get out of it. Obviously, attackers looking for any channel that they can. And we had, this is a push bombing attack, an MFA push bombing. And the attacker, when he's interviewed later, does a really good job of explaining basically what he did. I mean, he pushed messages constantly into one of the engineers, a contractor engineer for Uber. Was ignored, but found him through WhatsApp, contacted him through that other social channel, basically said, hey, this is going to, I have to do this in order to get a reset done in my systems. I need you to accept it so we can move on. He accepted it, and of course, we know what happened there. Also, other large-scale attacks happening in 2022 that we know I need to go into. 2023, things get very, very interesting. Evil Jinx, if you haven't heard about it, we're going to go into it in a little bit of detail. A very sophisticated attack engine, not looking for just random targets of opportunity, specifically aimed at targets that you choose, that an adversary chooses, and using Gen AI and other tools to help find the data points that we're going to need to construct an effective attack. It's kind of scary that way in terms of, you know, marrying the one and done package that you can buy along with some ability to collect some insight. Also, obviously, Windows Hello started to get a lot of traction. This is, you know, 8 years after that 2015 sort of release and launch of it, starting to get a lot of traction in business, but also seeing a lot of impact from Evil Jinx and adversary in the middle. We also had an article around the same time, this is about March of last year, that really caught my eye because this combination, again, the intersection of legitimate platforms, legitimate Gen AI platforms being used to gather the information that then powers MFA attacks and makes them successful, using legitimate platforms and AI to bypass MFA. So that leads us to like where we are today. And I want to pause and just look real quickly, courtesy of our friends at HelpNet, who did a really nice diagram, how a man-in-the-middle phishing kit or adversary-in-the-middle attack, it's very much like the man-in-the-middle attacks that we've always dealt with over the last 20 years or so in cybersecurity. But it is looking at a specific victim. It's very often looking for a specific victim, and there's tools within the kit that do the recon to go out and help you find out, how do I attract this specific target, get in the middle of that stream, enter the credentials, and then it works really just like a typical sort of man-in-the-middle attack. It's going to forward the credentials onto the destination server, return back a cookie, slide that off basically, or copy it, make it available to the threat actor, let the victim believe that their session goes, is continuing unabated. But very, very sophisticated in its ability to pinpoint the actual target, and it's enabled because of really those knowledge factors, passwords and knowledge factors, and things that are not sort of that are human derived knowledge factors rather than machine driven. And this kit, this whole package, is actually shockingly inexpensive. It's under $1,000. I could expense it on what I'm approved to expense through Axiad, so a little bit frightful in that way. So when I say what's wrong with MFA, again, not trying to pick on the technology, but look at what's happening today. If you look at a scale of improvement in their ability or capabilities or technologies over time, our authentication systems are not getting as good as the skills of our adversaries. That's sort of the bottom line. So how do we get in front of that? How do we jump in front of that? Well, part of it is we define strong MFA, and we start having people audit for strong MFA. It's a whole different way, I think, of looking at, like, not just checkbox, do you have MFA, which MFA is there? How are you doing MFA? How are you managing it? So we'll look at a couple of different audit regimes, basically, but I want to bring up a point that's going to become very important by the time we wrap up this webinar in another 15, 20 minutes or so. This is not a regulatory standard that a lot of people look at unless you happen to be in Canada, but it's Canada's enterprise cybersecurity strategy. In the latest version that came out, they did something that I found very appealing and instructive in terms of how they're looking at doing their audits. They don't just call it IAM. They've now sort of rephrased it and recentered the conversation around ICAM, identity, credential, and access management. So they've basically created another pillar that's, how are you going to manage credentials? How do you manage credentials? First off, what are credentials? What's appropriate for a credential? And how do you manage those at scale? And I really found that Canada's enterprise cybersecurity policy as of last year was the first one to really address this at scale that I noticed. But there's a lot of reference to it that goes back a couple of years. When you look at the executive order that we all know about from 2021 on improving the nation's cybersecurity, basically set this ball in motion that said, hey, CISA and OMB are going to come out, which they did not 6 months later, and said, we're going to define strong MFA. We're going to talk about what's required, at least in the government side, for within departments and agencies to do MFA, whether you're looking at on-prem or your local networks or service, external SaaS and services. So they're looking at strong MFA that's phishing resistant, which kind of becomes the catchphrase. CISA probably does the best job then. They turn to CISA and say, okay, great, give us a definition of what that means. And CISA probably does the best job of defining in detail with some technical specificity, what does strong MFA mean? This is a quick snapshot of a page that they have. But the key thing, the phishing resistant MFA, and they show you variations, gradations of what gets you to phishing resistance. At the top of the stack, using FIDO and WebAuthn technologies or using public key infrastructure as part of your authentication process. That's what the bottom line is. That's what everybody is sort of looking for. And it's obviously part of a journey. Really, if you go back to those SS7 exploits, where our experts and the analysts are trying to move us away from SMS, SS7-based, app-based technologies to phishing resistant that leverages FIDO, Fast Identity Online, or leverages some kind of PKI technology to get us into phishing resistance. And there is a lot of information on CISA. I would encourage everybody to go. There's a link that I include here on the government sites that looks specifically at what their definition is, how they define it, but they talk a lot about PKI-based solutions as well, and make the point of saying that there are organizations, particularly large, complex organizations, that are already using PKI at scale. Leverage that as part of your workforce MFA solution, as part of your authentication solution. The requirements for that go to other teams as well. CISA is one of those that I want to call out, because CISA obviously very, looking over their shoulder really at what does CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, asking them to do. And CISA has been in the middle of their own update, their own requirements for updating systems effective as of early this month, October 1st. And they've come out and said you have to have multi-factor authentication. They've been using NIST 800-63 as the definition for authentication requirements. But there's some interesting things. There's sort of some interesting gotchas if you look at. Let's first look at CISA or CISA and who is actually under the umbrella of CISA. Well, any federal law enforcement, so the FBI, DEA, anybody in that group, state and federal courts, anybody that's trying to access information from the criminal justice information system, and any private parties, lawyers, legal teams, analysts, advocates that are trying to get information from the criminal justice information system. And it covers a lot of ground and a lot of data. It covers the entire National Crime Information Center, background checks, automated fingerprint analysis and retrieval, national incident-based reporting, bioterrorism risk assessment group. These are all under the aegis, basically, of CISA. I didn't mean to make that rhyme, but I just did. And they're the ones that are responsible for creating that. So as you can see, there's a broad swath of people that FBI is mandating now must have improved multi-factor authentication whenever the device is used to access CJIS information, criminal justice information, whether from a corporate environment or a personal device. It's very, very strong, but there's a little bit of a loophole in it. We'll discuss the loophole in a little bit. Regulations are already being audited. If you live in the mountain states, really Montana down to California, those audits are happening this year. If you live in the Northwest where I live, or in some of the central states, those will be audited in 2025. And they'll be looking specifically at what things require strong MFA. So there's a connection here that I need to make that has to do with NIST. And it's NIST definition of IA5 authentication management, and how CJIS in their requirements is pointing to the NIST document, NIST 800-163, as the definition of what strong authentication should be. Obviously, or not obviously, NISA has defined AAL 1, 2, and 3, so authentication requirement areas. That's also wrapped up in 800-163, I think, volume B. But it gives some very clear definitions of, especially for more sensitive environments, AL2 and 3, the need to have cryptographic software and a cryptographic device that's actually part of the authentication experience and not susceptible to replay attacks. Now, this is, I think, where the gotcha actually is in this, and that CJIS, the requirement really just says, hey, you need to be not susceptible to replay attacks. So anybody that's been in cybersecurity for any length of time would look at the AAL1 requirements and say, well, really, OTPs are defense against replay attacks, and they are. But I would ask anybody that's under that umbrella for CJIS to start thinking ahead of what's going to be required. I think there's a loophole there, maybe for the first year, where you can say, if I've got an effective OTP system in place, I think I can buy some time. But shortly, I think as soon as the audits start picking up speed, you'll be looking at specific MFA in access in 5.5, 5.6, 5.14, and 5.18. Really the 4 key areas of CJIS that look at MFA definitions. And I think you'll hear, I know that I've heard from auditors, they'll be asking, okay, you have an OTP solution in place to take care of that point, but what are you going to do to move on from that? I point this just back to NIST to say, again, if you want the definition, and this top bullet should actually say 800-63, not 80, sorry about that, go to this document, the Authentication and Lifecycle Management for Digital Identities. That's, I think, the defining document for what's required. There are other federal groups, though, that cover a lot of ground and who are actively looking at changes in MFA. I put a little will above this, what regulations will require strong MFA. This is the update of the Federal Trade Commission's safeguards policy. This happened later in 2023. What I am hearing from really the auditors themselves and also the people at FTC responsible for defining these guidelines, we're going to see some movement in FTC also moving to strong FA and probably using the CISA definitions for strong MFA. Well, who's covered under FTC? An amazing swath of different enterprises and different groups. If you're in home lending or mortgage or finance, auto financing, if you're in service and hospitality industry, in liquor distribution or manufacturing, if you're in appliance manufacturing or jewelry, all of these come under FTC requirements. And I didn't really realize this until we had a customer, actually a couple of years ago, looking to implement strong MFA throughout their organization. And you can find it CarMax videos on YouTube that have some webinars that we've done in the past, largely driven because of the focus from FTC on their need to do strong MFA, and they had to rethink what they're doing with password management, with enterprise usage across multiple different security token types. I believe they had both Ubico as well as IDEMIA token types in play, and you can see that on that webinar, but they had to find a way to manage credentials across those. So I think that FTC was a great example. 2 other regulatory standards I want to look at, and then we'll start getting into the actual solution and what you need to do to deploy to fit some of these requirements. I want to look at PCI DSS, and I want to look at NERC real briefly. So PCI DSS, obviously the sort of the grandfather of many compliance regimes that we face, covering the entire payment industry. You'll see changes there in version 4. All access into the cardholder data environment, not just for administrators, any access, whether it's in automated systems or anything else, admin, non-admin, third-party vendor access, all looking at MFA and looking at strong MFA. No limits now to the type of access, whether it's cloud hosted on-prem. Again, not susceptible to replay attacks. I would take this and say that I think that in some PCI audits, if you're using OTP as your solution for that, people will look at that and say, okay, yes, by the letter of the law, you're not susceptible to a replay attack. However, as soon as replay attacks can foil an OTP solution, which we've seen some proof of that out in the wild, this becomes now needing to use stronger credentials. You're going to have to move away from OTPs. You already have to have 2 completely independent factors, and one of those really can't be a knowledge factor. So if you're using OTP and some kind of credential, you have to start thinking about a multi-credential environment. NERC SIPs, that's another version that was, version 5 was ratified in 2013. It tends to see a lot of suggestions for change, but if you know the bulk electric system and the players in it, it's a little bit, I think, slow moving in terms of wrapping around updates to things, but they are specifically looking at advanced MFA and continuous monitoring. And I see that trend in the groups, honestly, becoming much more vocal and much more specific, looking at if you're getting to a manager optimized stage for your overall security, the way that you get there is by implementing advanced MFA. So if that, particularly around certain NERC-CIP requirements, 0039 being revised for 2026, that's going to require authentication for all vendor authentication as a key security measure. And I suspect, if I was a betting man, that that's start going to be defined as strong or phishing resistant MFA. I think that's clearly the direction that they're going, the spirit behind it. So wrap this up in just a few minutes here. Thanks for your patience as we did sort of the history of MFA, where the regulatory standards are. If you're still with us, let's talk about how we fix it. What do we do to actually repair it? And it goes back to what I mentioned in the Canadian cybersecurity regulations, thinking about changing our thinking to ICAM thinking, to identity, credential, and access management. How am I going to manage credentials at scale in my organizations? An analyst who's done a really good job, I think, capturing this and driving sort of the spirit and direction of this is Gartner. If you happen to have a Gartner license, I'd encourage you to look up this particular piece of research that came out last year, but I think has gotten a lot of attention. Innovation insight for many flavors of authentication token. By authentication token, we're largely talking about the kind of credentials that you use. And in two different images, graphics that they included in this report, they called out the need for, as you can see, it goes from left to right. Those things on the left, don't invest in these anymore. Don't invest in out-of-bound messaging. Hold steady in the middle on these other investments. If you're looking at one-time password, which is a lot of what we've been talking about, or even mobile push, and look at new investments in what technologies, X509 and FIDO, some of the same things that we've been talking about. Those things that are knowledge factors that can be managed through credentials that are much more scalable and much more robust. And they even go into greater detail in the second half of the note, looking at specific, the vertical axes there are different use cases: network login, remote access, privileged access management, banking and finance, or consumer identity and access management. And that band across there says, for these use cases, start looking at, and that's dedicated devices or companion devices, start looking closely at using X509 and FIDO. These are the things that you have to get good at, basically, that you have to start managing well. So what does that look like in practice? My encouragement would be to look at the different use cases that you have, and everybody's environment is going to be a little bit different. But if we want to achieve identity, credential, and access management, let's start by creating a Venn diagram with sort of two groups in it. Those X509 based authentication uses, non-browser uses, workstations, mobile, iOS and Android, at least until we get to a point where FIDO is sort of at par there, server authentication. And that's probably, for most of our customers, about 40% of their use cases kind of fit that. For passkeys, for FIDO authentication, browser related use cases, single sign-on in your environments, Windows workstations, obviously, and that's, in our experience, about 60% of use cases. So find the shared use cases first. Authentication to Windows workstation can be made by both methods. That's a great example. So we can do both X509 and FIDO if we choose to on there, and we can ultimately try to get to a workflow that's the same for both. It doesn't matter what credential I'm using. I have the same authentication experience as a user. And also look hard at how we deliver authentication through hardware security keys. A lot of organizations don't want the additional cost of adding a hardware token, but I see it more and more and more as a justifiable cost. The cost has come way down. Even the most advanced ones like a Yubico Nano Key or IDEMIA's most advanced keys, the costs have come way down to $40, $45 per unit. It's actually created another problem, which there's so many available just through Amazon. How do you manage those if they're bought individually? How do you create a management for them? Well, fortunately, managing X509 and credentials through a credential management system becomes the way that we track and audit what those credentials actually are and what they say. Getting back to our topic, why auditors care about this, for any given token, I can have basically park my PIV-based authentication if it's a sort of government authentication or card, digital signatures, my key management system, card authentication, key attestation, basically manage that on that individual token. And that becomes the way I manage those credentials. If I don't want to use that, I can still manage that on a mobile device or mobile authenticator. This is an example of like Axiad's mobile authenticator, but really anybody, as you're using Okta Authenticator and you want to add credential management to it or strong credentials with PKI and FIDO, there's definitely a way to do that. You can leverage the TPM, the Trusted Platform Module, in the devices that you have and use device-bound FIDO, which does a really good job of securing the credential for that device in a way that's, again, a solid possession factor. The best practice and the best way to do it, and in this I'll talk a little bit about how Axiad does it, and again, trying not to make this more educational than a commercial, but find a tool or solution that has really good integration within the middle of your ecosystem effectively, right? So a way to work with your PKI providers, work with your IDP providers. And most of our customers, most out there, have multiple providers. They might have a Microsoft for part of their environment and have Entra ID, but they might also have Okta for part of their environment. If you're working with machine identities and you have a robust solution like Venafi that does phenomenal discovery across all of your devices for certificates and management, you can pull that into part of the ecosystem to do that credential management and understand where's PKI going to be managed, how is it going to be managed, and how is it affecting your multi-factor authenticators. Also on the lower right there, hardware devices. Again, if you're not already, start thinking about how hardware security devices are going to simplify your multi-factor authentication, especially if you just start with your sort of privileged users, the administrators, the executives in your company, and start with that, but you'll need a way to ultimately manage credentials across those. This is our big message from Axiad, and we'll repeat it over and over again. As you think about this journey to strong MFA, if you think about what CISA is asking you to do and regulatory standards, it's not a question of getting a new MFA. 9 times out of 10, your MFA is going to be fine. It's a question of augmenting your MFA with a system that does credential management, that does cloud-based enterprise PKI. A lot of organizations do not want to be in the PKI business anymore themselves. It's amazing how few new people coming out of school actually know and understand PKI. It's a little bit becoming a bit, if I may say, a bit of a dying art. So people don't want to do it. You can leverage a cloud-based solution that will manage your PKI for you and manage it in the use cases for multi-factor authentication that you need to. So don't rip and replace your current MFA. Just add a solution to it that does credential management, cloud-based PKI, and blends that into a web authentication service or services using different standards to do credential management, PKI management, and can integrate it into like the Microsoft's Oktas, ForgeRock's, One Identities, and Pings of the world that you're already relying on today. So ultimately, we get back to this guy. And my message for anybody that is looking at MFA or looking at audit or thinking about how their current MFA is going to withstand an audit, start looking at it from the perspective of the use cases and what's in your own segment. These are some examples of Axiad customers. And if you look at 3 different segments, financial services tends to be driven very often by fraud reduction or prevention. And they're looking specifically for ways to simplify, to understand where the credentials are and where they're being used, and to assure that MFA is appropriately deployed at all of the touch points in their organization. They tend to have implemented stronger MFA specifically to augment some of their GLBA type demands as well as PCI demands. And even if they're I have CarMax as an example on this, not necessarily known as a financial services company, known as one of the world's largest automotive dealers, but so deeply embedded in the financial process and looking for a way to simplify and homogenize authentication across many, many different sites and services. Another way to look at this is if you're in aerospace and defense. Obviously, things change a little bit in that scale. We're looking specifically for rated, tested, certified different tools and solutions, things that are compliant with CMMC, things that might be FedRAMP compliant, things that are definitely phishing-resistant MFA and that provide some sort of continuous compliance in the supply chain, understanding where I am in the supply chain. Actually, it also has a couple of customers in that case, and their needs are driven differently. They're not driven by compliance so much as they're driven by security architecture. And these conversations tend to focus on how do I guarantee the strength, the AAL 2 and 3 levels, for instance, using the NIST language at different points along this authentication process? And how do I use credentials to give me that information? The third example that I'm going to give is in manufacturing and transportation. Broad set of uses, but they tend to be looking at very, very rugged, robust solutions out in the real world. This is where security tokens do a really good job. They do a really good job of being that sort of center point of how authentication is going to work. You just need a solution to manage credentials, typically across multiple devices. I didn't realize until I really got into customer histories at Axiad about how many customers have multiple kinds of devices. They may have IDEMIA as well as having Thales, as well as having Ubico devices, and that makes the need for having a single management plane to come in and manage credentials across those devices much more important to scalability overall and the ease of rolling out lots of these devices in these really robust, difficult, kind of harsh environments that they deal with. There's one last point I want to bring up that's become very important as we start looking at, as we talk about credentials and the need to do PKI or X509 or TLS and also FIDO. A critical feature has sort of been missing from FIDO. FIDO's really been driven from the bottom up. And what I mean by that is when you look at PKI, it's really designed with the enterprise architecture, the enterprise identity policy in mind. That's where they start the discussion of how we're going to manage our PKI down through your third-party functions, the CAs that you work with, and ultimately downloading that certificate either on the device itself or on some hardware device that you're using or on even on your mobile device. So it's had a very top-down look from the organization, and it's fit the enterprise model really well. FIDO has not. Until recently, it's not often fit the enterprise model. It's really been a consumer-up driven workflow. How do we make it easy? Again, the name is Fast Identity Online for consumers to interact with the sites they go to all the time, the Amazons, the Googles, the Microsofts of the world, even when they're on multiple devices. So it's had a sort of a different approach, starting with the end user interaction up through the third-party functions. But FIDO 2 does a lot of things, particularly around attestation. I mentioned that you can now buy these tokens. Again, I'm showing the YubiKey Nano here. You can buy them on Amazon. You can buy them in bulk. How do you make sure that what you're monitoring in the field, in your environment, is the one that you bought for that employee, the one that you provisioned for that employee, and that has the credentials on it? There's a whole range of sort of credential management, oversight, and control necessary for the audit side of the world that's in the enterprise space that doesn't exist in the commercial space. Well, FIDO 2 with enterprise attestation has really gone a long way towards adding that capability to FIDO. So if you haven't looked at it already, I think it really gets very close to making FIDO tokens and credentials, which we know are as robust as their PKI counterparts in X509, just more manageable, easier to manage a device deployment strategy, easier to prevent the use of unknown devices that might have the right credential, but it's the combination of credential and hardware is not appropriate for what your policy says, and give you the ability to do a complete and accurate audit of what that deployment actually looks like. So I think that's really important improvement in the evolution of FIDO and FIDO 2 and where it's going. If you had a chance to go to the Authenticate conference a week ago or 2 weeks ago, a lot of great sessions on specifically that enterprise usage of FIDO and passkey tokens. One last look of like what that might look like in practice. This is sort of a glimpse of the Axiad console. You have a key, you have multiple different kinds of credentials, whether those are FIDO credentials, whether that's OTPs that you're still using, or whether that's using a X509 or PKI-based credential. Have the ability to sync credentials across those, to update credentials on any one of those, to let your employees at their own endpoints. We live in a very distributed world. I'm about 800 miles away from our corporate offices where I sit right now. How do I get them a credential and then manage it through them and allow them to do some self-service? That's through a console. That's through a solution like Axiad employs that lets you do those kind of details, retrieve the unique key basically for that hardware device, or disable it or reset a pin, and work with all of the things, the protocols and standards that make PKI and credential management actually work for you. So let's get to some resources. Hopefully this has been a educational discussion for you, and it hasn't felt too much like a commercial, but really important for me to make sure to get across the notion that credential management, that ICAM philosophy, is a key part now of your IAM strategy. What are some resources that you can use? Axiad has some solution blueprints. We have, as I've been saying, don't rip and replace your MFA solution, but augment it. We have a solution that specifically talks about that, future-proofing your MFA. We also have a solution brief on reinforcing FIDO. So if you're one of those customers, we have a few of these that have said, and in quotes, I'm all in on FIDO. That's the path we're going in the future. That's what it's going to look like. That does potentially create gaps. We looked at in the Venn diagram those things where FIDO is not up to par. It's not equally at par with other PKI use cases. How can we reinforce FIDO by building a system that's a hybrid credential management system that works with PKI where it needs to and FIDO where it needs to? That's another solution brief. I think that's going to be available through the center. If you are in the government space, if you're a government agency or department, there are very few solutions that let you have an MFA solution like Axiad Cloud that's FedRAMP ready. And we are now in agency review. We have a sponsor. We're in process with FedRAMP, hopefully by the end of this year, which is now, I think, as of tomorrow, only about 2 months away. We will be fully ATO'd through it, but knock on wood as these things happen. But it's a clear sign that we've built a solution that fits the FedRAMP model. It fits the demands of our specific customers. In this case, our sponsor is CDC, and looking at some of their unique needs in that agency and in the DHS, which is they're a child agency of. And I believe that it fitting the FedRAMP model as a solution is a really good indicator of the overall robustness of not just the company, but the design we have itself and how we're doing credential management at scale. So we go back to this guy, my doppelganger, my cousin, and how do we get him to sort of this view of the world, whether he is the IAM administrator director or whether he's the auditor. Ultimately, this is the state that we want to get to. We want to get phishing-resistant MFA in place. Want to get to happy IAM and audit teams. We don't want to get faced with questions that we can't answer, but we want to ask the important questions. Ask questions about what's the best kind of MFA that we can use. How does PKI that I already have and rely on, how can I leverage that to make my auditors happy and make my MFA work? So with that, we're going to turn it back over to Chrissy for some questions, and I will pause for a second here.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Michael. We do have a few questions that came in from the audience, so let's jump in. John has asked, does CISA explicitly require credentials with MFA?
It's a great question, John. So I kind of pointed this out earlier, but I want to be really explicit about it here. CISA's current requirements, and that, again, that's a big swath of government, federal, state agencies, and anybody that does legal teams, advisors that work with those groups, they must just have an MFA solution in place that's replay resistant or prevents replay attacks. And OTP does prevent replay attacks. So if you're just relying on an OTP solution as part of your MFA strategy, you will pass that, I think, that initial CISA audit. I would say ask your auditor how long they think that will last. They'll be very frank. And if you ask that question, they'll probably say, this is probably the last audit where you're going to get to use OTP without going to some hardened credential, some FIDO or PKI-based solution in it.
Perfect. Thanks, Michael. Next question is coming from Aaron, and they're asking, or they're saying, we use external outsourced PKI for web properties. Can we use this for MFA?
Short answer is yes, absolutely. So if you're using, if I understand that right, and you're using an external service to apply PKI to your services and workloads, like say your F5s or whatever throughout your organization, you can marry that to, for instance, the Axiad system that I was describing in the middle of that ecosystem and use that to provide credentials. Now there's a cost difference, obviously, if you're using server credentials versus user endpoint credentials. So you have to take sort of the whole scope of the solution in mind. It might be actually cheaper if you're using PKI just for your endpoints and users to use like a cloud-based one, like that you can get through Axiad Cloud. But first things first, look at the external PKI that you're already using, because you can probably leverage it.
Perfect. Next question comes from Steve. They're asking, does your product have CMMC compliance?
Thanks, Steve. So CMMC compliance for us kind of goes hand in hand with where we're at with our FedRAMP compliance. I don't know of a specific customer that's authorized it through CMMC. I should probably follow up on that and check back for you. But I think that the key point is our FedRAMP compliance and CMA compliance are relying on the same bits, the same architecture, the same design, moving through FedRAMP pretty fast. I don't think we will have any problem addressing CMMC, although that's becoming a bigger demand. Yes, absolutely.
Great, thank you, Michael. And I think we have time for just one more, so I'm going to grab this question from Kristen, who's asking, how much does it cost to add strong MFA to an existing solution with, as an example, 400 users?
That's the kind of question that they hate doing on webinars. I appreciate it, but thank you, because so much depends on the other pieces of it. So I will give you an answer though, and I'd say you should look to spend between $40,000 to $60,000, I think, for upwards of 500 users to add a solution that does credential management to your MFA. And as I say that, in my head, it sounds like a big number, but it's really just a small piece of augmenting your current MFA spend. So I think come to the table with your current MFA bill, come to the table with what it would cost if, for instance, the vendor of your MFA says, hey, I can make that phishing resistant for you. I think Okta has a solution that you can add on, for instance. Take that price and then give us a call or talk to us about like how we could potentially augment it with a different solution. In most cases, our cost, not all, but in most cases, our cost to augment an MFA solution with our Axiad cloud solution and bring it to bear and provide credential management and phishing resistance is less than doing an add-on. In some of your MFA cases, you don't even have that option. You have to look at an external solution. I think the number that you mentioned was something 400 or 500 customers also, or users. I would think ahead when you start looking at how you're going to sort of support your MFA going forward and your credential management within MFA. Think about not only what you have now, but what you're going to have, say, 10 years from now, or even 5 years from now. If your scale is going to rapidly increase, every one of our customers is increasing at a pretty significant clip, and that could be in terms of the number of MFA implementations and users. I think that's a combination of their greater awareness on MFA and needing to deploy it throughout their organization, but also a lot of our customers are in the technology space or in the finance space, and they themselves are growing. So the numbers within their organization are growing. So be growth minded and think about, yes, what it's going to cost to get your foot in the door, but also think about the long-term solution kind of going side by side with your MFA solution. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, that's great feedback, Michael. Thank you so much. Thank you to those that submitted questions for today's webinar. Thank you, Michael, for wonderful insights on today's webinar. On behalf of Axiad and CyberEdge, we thank everyone for spending some time with us today on this webinar. The winner of the $100 Amazon e-gift card will be randomly selected and notified via email within 2 business days, so keep an eye on your inbox. Good luck and have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.